German forces near the outskirts of Moscow on September 30th, 1941. Fierce combat to the west had severely depleted the Red Army, leaving minimal forces to safeguard the capital. The German High Command strategy aimed to capture the Soviet capital within 10 to 12 weeks of crossing the Soviet Union's border. However, the tenacious resistance of Soviet troops, particularly during the Battle of Smolensk, delayed the Wehrmacht's advance, and they only reached Moscow after 14 weeks, significantly later than anticipated. Moscow held immense significance not only as the Soviet Union's capital and political nucleus, but also as a vital hub for industry and transportation. A substantial portion of the European Soviet Union's railway network converged on this very city. Furthermore, the fall of such a pivotal metropolis was intended, under the German plan, to engender profound demoralization within the Red Army and the entire Soviet populace. Hitler and his generals harbored the belief that seizing Moscow would lead to the complete collapse of Soviet resistance and an accelerated conclusion to the war in the East. As the German forces drew closer to Moscow, it became increasingly evident to the Soviet side that they were significantly outnumbered. The Bryansk, Western, and Reserve fronts comprised approximately 1,250,000 military personnel. Within Moscow itself, 21 divisions of the People's Militia were hastily formed, consisting of roughly 200,000 volunteers, including factory workers, office employees, students, and many other city dwellers. Recognizing the gravity of the threat, the Stavka, the Supreme Soviet military leadership, resolved to redeploy 9 additional divisions from the far east to the capital. This strategic maneuver was facilitated by Soviet intelligence, which had ascertained that Japan had no immediate plans to attack the Soviet Union. The strength of the German forces at this juncture amounted to approximately 2 million individuals. However, the disparity extended beyond mere numbers. Soviet units had already sustained considerable casualties, and the newly arrived replacements often lacked adequate combat experience. Even outdated weaponry, remnants from the Tsarist era, was pressed into service. Germany, conversely, maintained a formidable advantage in material. Approximately 1,700 German tanks faced 990 Soviet tanks. Over 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars were pitted against 7,600, and 1,390 aircraft were deployed against the Red Army's 667. While different sources offer slightly varied figures, the Wehrmacht's superiority was undeniably substantial. Although German generals had hoped to secure Moscow before the onset of cold weather, the reality was that the Germans encountered not only Soviet resistance, but also the treacherous Russian terrain and the autumn mud of 1941, which ensnared tanks and trucks. Many roads were rendered impassable. As winter approached, the weather conditions intensified. The Germans themselves frequently cited the extreme cold. However, it is crucial to emphasize that Soviet soldiers faced no easier circumstances. Many new recruits lacked proper winter clothing. Some were forced to make do with older greatcoats, while some militia members were equipped only with outdated jackets. Nevertheless, the Red Army proved more psychologically prepared to fight in the harsh cold, as they were defending their capital and had no option to retreat. The situation for the Wehrmacht was further complicated by the actions of Soviet partisans, who disrupted German supply lines. The so-called Rail War, characterized by widespread sabotage of railways and attacks on truck convoys, caused severe disruptions in the delivery of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. German logistics struggled to adequately supply the troops, which, in turn, hampered their ability to conduct full-scale offensive operations. The Germans achieved a significant tactical victory by encircling four Soviet armies near Vyazma, resulting in immense losses. Precise figures remain elusive. German assessments often cite 670,000 prisoners of war. However, this figure sometimes included conscription-age men apprehended in occupied territories. Despite the heavy toll, the Soviet command managed to gain precious time by prolonging the German efforts to liquidate the pocket. During these weeks, the capital's defenses were strengthened, anti-tank obstacles were erected, and the transfer of reserves was completed. On November 7, 1941, amidst the imminent threat, a military parade took place in Moscow, an event of profound symbolic significance for the entire Soviet nation. Stalin's personal presence in Moscow and the very ceremony of the parade carried immense symbolic weight. It conveyed to both Muscovites and the Allied powers of the anti-Hitler coalition that Moscow would not fall. Red Army soldiers received a powerful morale boost, and the Germans were confronted with a compelling display of Soviet resolve. By this time, Allied negotiations for Lend-Lease were underway, but these supplies had not yet significantly impacted the situation around Moscow. By December 1941, the Red Army's resupply remained primarily an internal affair, relying on evacuated factories and existing Soviet resources. The Americans only entered the war after Pearl Harbor, which occurred after December 7, 1941. Britain itself required resources for its campaign against Germany in North Africa. Consequently, Moscow's defense was predominantly sustained by domestic efforts. By the time German units reached the immediate approaches to the capital, they were critically exhausted. The Wehrmacht suffered from shortages of ammunition, fuel, and fodder. Logistics could not keep pace with demands. Had the Germans dared to launch a direct assault on the metropolis, they would have required fresh troops. However, Army Group Center had no such reserves remaining, given the prolonged autumn and winter campaigns. Furthermore, any complications on the flanks would have exposed the Germans to the risk of encirclement, a scenario that would later unfold at Stalingrad. On December 5th, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive under the command of Generals Zhukov and Timoshenko, forcing a rapid German retreat. Due to fuel shortages, some tanks and vehicles were abandoned. Several simply failed to start in the severe frost. The offensive against Moscow failed, although by January 1942, the Germans managed to stabilize the front and halt further Red Army advances. As the Soviet side also lacked the resources and transport to deliver ammunition, the Wehrmacht's cumulative losses on the Eastern Front since June 22, 1941, surpassed 700,000 men. The German offensive potential was depleted. Colonel General Heinz Guderian wrote in his memoirs, "We suffered a serious defeat, which, due to the stubbornness of the High Command, soon led to fatal consequences." The Army High Command, situated far from the front, did not grasp the real situation in winter conditions. This ignorance led to new, unfulfillable demands. Often, understated figures for German losses and inflated estimates for Red Army casualties are cited. However, with an official figure of 500,000 German losses against 950,000 killed Soviet soldiers, plus 900,000 wounded, the Germans would theoretically have retained sufficient strength to continue their offensive. In reality, the Wehrmacht's losses were far more substantial. Undocumented cases, missing accounting documentation, and falsified reports from German command meant that many historians still lack precise data. Alongside the miscalculations of the German generals, the resolve of the Soviet soldiers and commanders played a paramount role, from regular divisions to the People's Militia units. The Stavka did not hesitate to deploy very young cadets and inadequately trained militiamen, But it was precisely their sacrifice that bought crucial days and weeks. The Germans underestimated the fact that people were prepared to die for Moscow, defending every kilometer of its approaches. Thus, near Moscow, the enemy suffered its first significant defeat, demonstrating to the world that Blitzkrieg was not an invincible strategy. The Russian soldier was not merely a propaganda image, but a tangible force capable of countering German technological and organizational superiority. This is precisely why the Germans never initiated a full-scale assault on the Soviet Union's capital. The Wehrmacht lacked the resources, and the Soviet forces endured the pressure of enemy numbers and the threat of a harsh winter. Despite the extremely challenging conditions, the Red Army and the population of Moscow, having endured colossal losses and the chaos of the war's early months, managed to keep the German forces at bay. In the history of World War II, this defensive campaign is considered one of the pivotal moments, becoming a symbol of the Soviet people's courage and resilience.